Hi, I'm Jimmy. In this video, we're going to do a quick review of an investment portfolio. Now, this portfolio came from another YouTuber that I'm actually a big fan of. And I'm hoping that this video will be part of a new series where we look at different investment portfolios, not just from YouTubers, but from anybody. So if you like the idea, please let me know in the comments below. And if you're curious to have me review your investment portfolio, shoot me an email at this email address. Now, don't send me the entire portfolio. Just shoot me the email, tell me you'd be interested, give me a little bit about yourself. I'll send you some questions and we'll see if we can go forward from there. I'm not sure how many of these we're going to get, so we'll see where it goes. But either way, here's what we're going to do. We're going to look quickly at the investments in the portfolio, where the portfolio could do well, how diversified it is, where it could get hurt, and then I'll throw in my 2 cents for what I think we could do to improve the investment portfolio. So first, a bit about the YouTuber that I teamed up with for our first portfolio review. Her name is Anna, and her channel is called Panda Boss. I'll leave a link in the description below to her channel. Now, her channel is actually quite awesome. You got to go check it out. She does a lot more personal finance stuff than we do on this channel, so I actually think it's a very nice complement to what the Learn to Invest community talks about. So again, go check out her channel. Either way, let's jump to her portfolio. So she's got 51 different holdings in her investment portfolio. And as we scroll through these holdings, well, my first thought is that this looks fairly well diversified. And we can see that her largest group of holdings is actually ETFs. ETF is short for Exchange Traded Fund, and we'll come back to this one in a second. After ETFs, she's got about 17% of her portfolio in healthcare, which is a decent amount for one sector. And these types of stocks tend to be more defensive, so assuming this was done on purpose, I'm okay with the more defensive approach as long as it was done on purpose. Sometimes people add companies without really thinking about the big picture of the portfolio. Now, I did ask Anna why she had such a large piece of her portfolio in what appeared to be defensive holdings. Here's what she had to say.
Hi Jimmy, thanks so much for choosing me as your first portfolio review. I've loved your channel for ages and it's just such an honor to be chosen to be the first one. So in terms of the healthcare sector, I wanted to invest in it as you said, it's a great defensive sector. As I've learned more about investing, I've learned that it's really important to invest in stocks and sectors that you know and use, and in my opinion, healthcare is just that. We're always going to need healthcare. People are always going to get sick, and we also have an aging population, which means more and more people are going to be spending more money on healthcare. And whilst that healthcare will change with time, I'm making an assumption that the big healthcare companies are going to grow with it and change with it. Healthcare is also the second largest sector of the S&P 500 index, and I also think that healthcare itself is really broad because you've got things from pharmaceuticals to things like biotech, so loads of diversity within the sector itself. As a general rule, and as you've pointed out, my portfolio at the moment is quite skewed towards very defensive stocks and ETFs. Generally, this is because I've been a really risk-averse investor until now. I'm still quite new to investing and I really wanted to just dip my toes in and go for the more defensive, safe stocks as I was learning the ropes. I actually have a lot of people who always say to me that you can be riskier with your investments when you have a longer time horizon, so essentially addressing the fact that I am quite young. But I do plan to retire at 35, or at least partially rely on my investments and just working part-time. So I feel like my time horizon isn't necessarily as long as people think. As a result, I do want to be safer in the majority of my holdings, but I'm definitely going to take on board what you're saying and make some changes to my portfolio.
Okay, thanks, Anna. So her staying defensive makes sense given that that is where she's most comfortable at. Also, when you consider how high the stock market is right now, being defensive just in case they're worried to be a pullback in the stock market could make a lot of sense. Now, the fact that she wants to one day have her dividends offset or completely replace her need for an external income, this is sort of more cash she can generate, I think her sticking with defensive stocks, again, could make a lot of sense. Now, as far as the changes that I've recommended to her, well, there aren't too many of them. I think overall she's got a fairly decent portfolio. But before we can really jump to that conclusion, I actually want to bring out another aspect of portfolio management or portfolio analysis that I think is important and sometimes overlooked. And that's to look at what is inside the ETFs that we currently own. So we can see that Anna owns a few ETFs. And what I did is I went back and looked to see what the individual holdings for each of those ETFs are. And ideally, can you get a weighting for how much that particular stock represents in the ETF? You combine that with the stocks that she picked by hand, and now we end up with a much larger portfolio. Now, if a stock that she picked out personally was in an ETF, or maybe the same stock was in multiple ETFs, I combined those stocks and just increased the position by the appropriate amount. Now we can see that she has almost 2,200 holdings, up from the 51 companies that she had 51 holdings, including ETFs, that she had picked out. Now, a lot of this can just look like noise, since many of these companies have weights that are super tiny. So I think a simpler way to look at this entire portfolio, at least from a broad perspective, is to just look at the sectors. But if you're analyzing your own portfolio, this can be a great exercise to go through, because then you get to see if you accidentally bought the same company too many times. You can see where everything really, how big of a position you really have in different companies, or sectors for that matter. So with Anna's sectors side by side, now we can see that her portfolio actually looks even more diversified, since her 28 or 29% that she had in ETFs are now spread out amongst all these other sectors. So I'm glad that we did this breakdown, because one suggestion that I was going to bring up before I broke the portfolio down like this was perhaps there wasn't enough weighting in growth stocks. Sure, there's some growth stocks, some growth in information technology, that they have stocks like Microsoft, Apple, AMD. So that's good, and those are good growth stocks. But considering how young she is and how many of her investments are long-term investments, it just seemed that this was a very defensive portfolio. When you look at companies or sectors like consumer staples, healthcare, that's pretty defensive. Real estate even has some defensive characteristics to it. Now, I get her desire to set up herself, to position herself in a defensive portfolio, and that's what she's comfortable at, so there's something to be said about that. But I was questioning whether there should be more growth to the overall portfolio. But frankly, her ETFs appear to have handled this. Sure, it's still a little bit defensive, but that's fine given that's where she's comfortable at. I think it's very important to find what level of risk you're comfortable with and then sticking in that lane. But I do think that if she was looking to add one or two more positions, I think looking for growth prospects I think her portfolio can more than handle a bit more growth, even though in many cases growth is overvalued right now. Now, there is another consideration that I think can sometimes be a big deal depending on our investment portfolio. So Anna lives in the UK, and her home currency is the British pound. But when we switch back to her main holdings, her main 51 holdings, well, we may notice that a lot of her companies are American companies that do a lot of business in the US dollar. And just to illustrate, if we switch over to this chart, this is a one-year chart of the pound versus the US dollar. And we may notice that the pound is getting stronger relative to the US dollar, which means that it takes more dollars to get the same amount of pounds. So for an investor, this means that it's possible for a UK investor that they are losing money because of the currency conversion rate. Now, long term, this may not matter all that much, because a lot of this stuff will end up balancing itself out over many years. But I bring this up because perhaps it could make sense to add a British company to her portfolio to help offset this a bit. Perhaps a British company that even has some growth. Two birds, one stone. And if the pound keeps strengthening, well, that company wouldn't be hurt as much. So in theory, that could help balance out her portfolio a bit. Besides that, I'm not sure there's too much about her portfolio that needs any adjustments at this point. It's a fairly well-balanced portfolio that could do very well over the long term. And if she keeps adding to it now, well, I'm sure she can position her portfolio to set herself up to pay a fair amount of dividends when she wants to live off those dividends. Now, Anna and I have spoken a few times about her investment portfolio and her investing style. And if you're curious about the changes that she's making to her portfolio, well, she actually just published a video over on her channel walking through her portfolio and the changes she's making. So if you're looking to improve your investment portfolio, perhaps that's a good next video for you to watch. I got a link right here. I got a link in the description below. And thank you so much for sticking with me all the way to the end of the video. I really appreciate it. Go over to Anna's channel, check it out. It's called Panda Boss. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.